Hey guys, so my fellow bandmates and I have been doing a lot of songwriting lately, trying to get the band thing going, but we're planning on doing a lot of recordings soon. And since we're a metal band, metal typically has the same instrumentation. You've always got drums, you've always got bass, and you've always got guitars. So whenever you open up a new project, you spend a lot of time doing the same things over and over again. You're always going to have a track for your guitar, you're always going to route that to a bus, and you're always going to use similar plugins. So instead of repeating all these things over and over again every time you start a new project, I thought it would help to save some time by making a template, which is what I have here. This is what I'm calling my metal template. And what this does, it's got a lot of the work done for you already, so that it takes you most of the way there and just makes it easier so you can spend more time recording and mixing instead of fidgeting around and figuring out how everything needs to be set. So let's just dive in. Let me show you what I've got going on here. We've got all the instrument tracks. You can see I've got my drum stuff here. I've got a bass right here, a couple guitars, and then an extra MIDI channel in case I want to do some strings or synth or something like that. So starting with the drums, this first channel here is the whole drum kit, and what I do is using Ultra Beat, I'll map out my drum part, make the beats, and I'll get all that finished. I'll drag that here, and once I've got the whole drum part, what I can do is break this up into sections, which is what I've got here. I've got the kick drum and the snare. And this isn't even the same kit as the Ultra Beat kit. These are all specific parts that I've chosen. I picked out this kick drum and I picked out this snare and the toms and the ride and the cymbals. So that way I have my own custom drum kit that sounds the way I want it to sound. If you look at the mixer, you can see that I've even got some of the levels adjusted already so that the kit is already fairly balanced. Now, from song to song, I may have to make a few adjustments, but again, at least this is taking me most of the way there. So that's really cool. And then I've got, just some EQ on here and a few plugins that I'm going to use. And since they are programmed drums, most of the time you're just going to use the same EQ. But again, that might change from song to song, but it's still nice to have the EQ on there so I can see what I did before and kind of get an idea of how I like to shape the drum kit. I've also got these drums routed to different buses. I've got the snare sent to this bus here where I can add some reverb and then control the levels of how much of it I want in the mix. I've got a room bus here just to kind of liven up the drum kit as much as I can. And then I send all of that to one final bus where I can control the whole drum kit. So moving on from there, we've got the bass. And again, what I've got here are some plugins that I always use for the bass. And then I've got this routed to a couple buses. I have a bus here where I just distort the crap out of the bass, and then I take that distorted track and blend it in with the clean track, so you get a really gritty bass. And then I've got all that routed to one bass bus that controls everything. So moving on from bass to guitars, you can see I've got two of them here, left and right. Most of the time that's what I'm going to use, but if I need an extra track for like a solo or just some other stuff, I can just duplicate that and record it. And again, I've got plugins here that I always use for the guitars, and then I've got them routed to a bus here where I have control over all the guitars. And that's pretty much the basic instrumentation, and I can always add more tracks if I need them, which is what I'll do for vocals, because usually I like to get the music sounding good first before I bring the vocals in anyway, so I didn't feel like it was necessary to have them a part of the template. So whenever you're recording or mixing, it's really important to use a reference, which is what I have here. I've got all these song files here that I can drag into these reference tracks that I've made over here. These songs, I picked them out because they have certain sounds that I like about them. So for instance, this song here, My Curse, I've got the whole song right here, but then I've got it broken up. I have a guitar track of that song, a bass track, and a drum track. So I can kind of get an idea of how the parts sound individually and together. But it's important to listen for certain things. So for instance, when I'm doing my guitar tones, I like to use this song here by X-Toll. If you listen to X-Toll's last album, they have an awesome guitar tone, and so I'm trying to kind of get as close to that as possible. I know it's not likely because I don't have the same gear that they used, but as long as I can get close to that, then I know that I'll have a pretty good mix. I have a couple Periphery songs on here because they have a really good sounding bass, and I like the way their snare sounds, so I'll listen to that and try to get my snare sounding as closely as possible. Then I've got a track on here from Impending Doom because they have a really beefy kick drum, and I'm kind of trying to get our tracks to sound pretty heavy too, so I have a reference for that. So another thing I like to do that's very important is I usually like to have a few plugins that affect the whole track. The problem is if I just put them on the output here, it's going to affect everything, including my reference tracks. So it's really annoying to listen to your mix and then have to bypass the plugins just to hear the reference track and see if it sounds similar. So what I made a mix bus right here, and I've got all of my instruments. I've got my guitars, my bass, my drums. They all go through their buses, and then they have one final bus that goes to the mix bus. And this is where I can affect everything, but without affecting the reference tracks. If you look at the reference tracks, they're just routed to the output, but everything else is routed to this mix bus here, and then the mix bus goes to the output. I do, however, have this gain plugin on here. The reason I have this on here is because I like to switch to mono when I mix. That's really important. If you get your mix sounding good in mono, then when you switch back to stereo, it's going to sound awesome. So I want everything to be in mono, including the reference tracks. So that's why I have that on the output bus. So taking the time to set this up is really helpful and saves you a lot of time in the long run. And what's great about it is that you can always update it. So if you come up with like a new guitar tone that you really like, you can just save that as a new template so that you don't have to find those plugins again and remember the settings and write it all down. You can just have it all saved and ready to go for your next project. The one downside though is because everything is routed and there's so many tracks and there's so many plugins and buses, it kind of makes things laggy. So because of the latency, it's a little tough to record. It's not real bad, but if you're doing really technical, precise music or something that's really fast with a lot of notes, kind of like what we're doing with our band, it's pretty much impossible to record. So that's why I made another template for tracking. So what I have here is a tracking template, and as you can see, it is super simple. I've got a drum track, a guitar track, and a bass track. No reference tracks, no buses, no routing of any kind, and just the bare minimum plugins. So I can get the drum loop set here and then go ahead and record the guitar part. And once I've got something I'm happy with, I can take the audio files from here and drag them back over into the other project where I can mix them. And that's pretty much it. Now I did this in Logic Pro, but you can take the same concept and do it in any DAW. So hopefully some of you guys found this helpful. But I'm really looking forward to doing some recording, and hopefully I'll have some new music coming out for you guys soon. Until next time.